In June 1942, the Japanese combined fleet moved eastward across the Pacific with a confidence earned, not imagined. 6 months earlier, Pearl Harbor had stunned the world. Since then, Japanese naval aviation had advanced almost without resistance, carrier by carrier, island by island. The coming operation aimed at a remote atoll called Midway was conceived not as a gamble but as a conclusion. Every major carrier was present. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the veterans of Pearl Harbor formed the core of the striking force. Battleships followed in support, cruisers guarded the flanks, submarines screened the approaches. The plan was vast, layered, and precise. It reflected the full confidence of an empire at its military zenith. On paper, every contingency had been addressed. A diversionary attack in the Aleutians would fracture American attention. Submarine picket lines would provide early warning. Reconnaissance schedules were carefully timed. Strike waves were calculated down to the minute. This was not merely an operation, it was choreography. Japanese intelligence predicted surprise and confusion. American morale was assumed fragile, their carrier force diminished and hesitant after months of defensive posture. If the enemy reacted, it would be late. If they counterattacked, it would be uncoordinated. Japanese planners expected to dictate the tempo from first contact to final blow. The operation felt surgical, inevitable. Midway would be bombed, its airfields neutralized. American carriers, rushing in response, would be lured into range and destroyed in a decisive fleet action, the long-sought Kantai-Kessen. The Pacific War, it was believed, would be settled not by attrition, but by a single, overwhelming demonstration of control. Within this confidence lay a deeper assumption that time itself was predictable, that schedules would hold, that minutes could be managed as reliably as steel and fuel. Japanese doctrine trusted preparation over improvisation, precision over haste. It had worked before. There was no reason to believe it would not work again. As the fleet sailed on, decks busy and radios quiet, nothing suggested fragility. The plan moved forward like a machine already in motion, and no one, on any bridge or in any planning room, yet understood that the greatest variable in the Pacific was not the enemy, but the clock. The morning ahead appeared calm, too calm to hurry. Dawn on the 4th of June, 1942, arrived without drama. The Pacific lay calm beneath a pale sky, its surface broken only by the wakes of ships moving steadily east. On the Japanese carriers, the day began as countless others had measured, orderly, familiar. There was no sense of rupture, no hint that history had chosen this morning to turn. Flight decks came alive with routine precision. Ground crews moved with practiced economy, guiding aircraft into position, checking control surfaces, securing fuel lines. Engines were warmed, radios tested. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with salt air, an ordinary scent in an extraordinary war. Everything followed schedule. Nothing pressed. Reconnaissance aircraft were prepared for launch. Float planes and scout planes were dispatched to search wide arcs of ocean, extending the fleet's awareness outward into the empty blue. One aircraft launched late. Another sector was covered more slowly than planned. These were minor imperfections, the sort absorbed daily by any large operation. No one marked the time. From the bridges, there was nothing to provoke urgency. No contacts reported, no signals intercepted. The enemy remained absent, abstract, distant. The expectation was not of confrontation, but of sequence. First Midway, then the American response. Events were assumed to unfold in their proper order. No alarms sounded. No sharp commands cut through the morning air. The carriers maintained cruising speed. Combat air patrols flew their assigned patterns. Fighters rose and fell as they always had. Vigilant but unhurried. Discipline, not haste. Defined readiness. Schedules felt comfortable because they were familiar. Japanese naval aviation was built on the belief that correct procedure produced correct outcomes. When operations began on time, they were expected to remain on time. Delays were variables, not threats. Somewhere in that quiet, the first small delay passed, unnoticed. A message would arrive later than planned. A decision would wait for confirmation. Minutes would be consumed without consequence, at least none that could yet be seen. The fleet continued forward, confident that the morning belonged to them. And as the sun climbed higher, the clock moved with it, indifferent to doctrine, unmoved by certainty. What mattered would not be the noise of battle, but the silence before it. Shortly after sunrise, a scout aircraft broke the calm. Launched from a cruiser on the fleet's outer screen, it moved low over the water, searching a sector that doctrine considered safe. For hours, nothing interrupted the rhythm of flight until dark shapes appeared on the horizon, distant but unmistakable. The report was sent, but it arrived late. Mechanical delay, launch timing, and distance had already consumed minutes that could not be recovered. When the message reached the fleet, it was incomplete enemy ships sighted, but numbers uncertain. More critically, the type of ships was not immediately clear. Carriers were not confirmed. Possibility replaced certainty. In the combat information centers, classification began. Codes were checked, bearings compared. Officers weighed the meaning of fragmentary words transmitted through static and distance. The Japanese system prized accuracy, and accuracy required verification. No one wished to misidentify cruisers as carriers, or shadows as substance. Command hesitated not from indecision, but from discipline. There were interpretations that suggested a limited American presence, perhaps a scouting force reacting too late. Others hinted at something larger. Each possibility carried different consequences. Each demanded a different response. Acting prematurely risked disrupting a carefully balanced plan. Procedures demanded confirmation. Additional scouts were tasked. Messages were relayed up the chain of command. Questions were asked that could only be answered with time. The fleet continued its existing operations while clarity was sought, believing the margin still belonged to them. But clarity arrived slowly. Each minute stretched the distance between detection and action. What had once been a warning became a puzzle, and then a concern. By the time the presence of American carriers began to solidify, the window for simple adjustment had narrowed. The clock continued moving, indifferent to rank or doctrine. Decisions delayed by minutes would soon demand answers in seconds. And while the fleet worked to understand what it was seeing, the enemy already understood was moving with purpose. By the time certainty emerged, time itself had taken a side. Japanese naval aviation entered the Pacific War guided by a belief system forged in years of careful preparation and early success. It prized perfection not as an abstract ideal, but as a practical doctrine. A strike, properly planned and flawlessly executed, was expected to overwhelm any defense. Disorder was seen not as adaptability, but as failure. Carrier operations were therefore conceived as coordinated masterpieces. Aircraft were launched in balanced waves, fighters and bombers arranged to arrive together, striking simultaneously from multiple axes. The goal was not speed for its own sake, but synchronization. A blow delivered in harmony was believed to be decisive, leaving no space for recovery or counterattack. This philosophy extended deep into the mechanics of flight decks and hangars. Aircraft were armed carefully and sequentially. Bombs and torpedoes were not rushed into place. They were handled methodically, inspected, aligned, and secured according to protocol. Crews were trained to value correctness over haste because mistakes with fuel and ordnance were unforgiving. Timing within this system was treated as predictable. Japanese planners assumed that once a sequence began, it would unfold as designed. Delays were considered manageable deviations, not existential threats. The idea that minutes could vanish beyond recovery, that time itself could become an adversary, was rarely entertained. Initiative was centralized. Decisions flowed downward from senior command, ensuring coherence across the fleet. This structure reduced confusion and prevented reckless individual action. It also meant that sudden changes required approval, discussion, and consensus. Independence was limited, not because officers lacked ability, but because unity was valued more highly than improvisation. Flexibility, as a result, was subtly discouraged. Deviating from the plan implied that the plan had been flawed, and Japanese doctrine was built on the assumption that correct planning eliminated the need for adjustment. To change course too quickly risked unraveling the entire operational design. This belief had been reinforced by experience. At Pearl Harbor, precision had delivered shock. In the Indian Ocean, coordination had crushed British naval power. Success confirmed doctrine. Doctrine became certainty. But embedded within this certainty was an assumption that would go untested until Midway. That time would always be available. That the enemy would respond on schedule. That initiative could be seized, held, and controlled through planning alone. What doctrine did not account for was an opponent willing to act imperfectly but immediately. It did not anticipate attacks that failed tactically yet succeeded strategically by consuming attention and altitude. It did not imagine a battle in which seconds, not formations, decided survival. As the fleet moved closer to Midway, this faith and precision shaped every decision. Decks remained orderly. Procedures remained intact. The machinery of excellence continued to turn smoothly, confidently, and increasingly slowly. And beneath that confidence, the margin for error narrowed with every passing minute. On the morning of June 4, Japanese carriers were not ruled by urgency, but by control. Everything about their operation reflected confidence in process. Decks were busy, but never frantic. Orders were issued calmly. Movements followed familiar patterns refined through years of training. This was how a powerful fleet was meant to function: deliberate, disciplined, composed. Rearming cycles proceeded by protocol. Aircraft returning from the first strike against Midway were recovered, inspected, and moved below decks. Bombs were removed. Torpedoes were prepared. Fuel lines remained connected. Each step followed a sequence designed to minimize accidents and maximize efficiency. The system worked provided nothing interfered. Deck crews followed established order with professional precision. They were not slow, they were thorough. In Japanese doctrine, speed was a byproduct of correctness, not its replacement. A rushed operation invited mistakes, and mistakes on a carrier deck were lethal. Control was safety. Control was strength. Then, ordnance was changed twice. Initially, aircraft were armed for land targets. When reports suggested American ships might be present, the order was given to reconfigure for anti-ship attack. Bombs were removed. Torpedoes brought forward. Later, uncertainty crept back in, and preparations shifted again. Each change was logical, based on the information available at the moment it was made. No single decision appeared catastrophic. Each adjustment reflected prudence. Commanders were not panicking. They were responding responsibly to evolving intelligence. To commit prematurely would have been reckless. To wait for clarity seemed wise. But clarity demanded time. And time, though invisible, was being spent lavishly. Below decks, hangars filled with aircraft in various states of readiness. Bombs and torpedoes accumulated. Fuel hoses remained connected. The system, designed for orderly transition, became congested by its own caution. What was meant to preserve control quietly magnified vulnerability. From the bridge, the carriers still appeared formidable. Combat air patrols were airborne. The enemy had not yet struck decisively. There was no obvious crisis to interrupt the process. The illusion of control held. Yet control, when unchallenged, can become comfort. And comfort dulls the instinct to compress time. Every additional check, every careful pause, every confirmation consumed minutes that could not be reclaimed. The machinery of perfection continued to turn, unaware that it was tightening its own constraints. In isolation, each choice made sense. Together, they formed a pattern, one that privileged order over urgency, completeness over speed. The carriers were not unprepared. They were prepared too carefully for a battle that would not wait. As decks filled and procedures continued, the fleet believed it still dictated the pace. But somewhere above, beyond sight and sound, another force was aligning, one that required no permission, followed no protocol, and would arrive without regard for process. By the time urgency became undeniable, control would already be lost. At Midway, Japanese command did not expect to be attacked first. That assumption shaped every decision that followed. The enemy, as understood through months of combat, was cautious and reactive. American carriers were believed to be distant days, not hours, away from meaningful intervention. The initiative, it was assumed, remained firmly in Japanese hands. This belief was not arrogance alone, it was built on precedent. Japanese forces had consistently struck before being struck. Surprise had been their most reliable weapon, delivering decisive results from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean. At Midway, there was no reason to believe the pattern would break. As a result, fighter cover remained routine. Combat air patrols flew at standard altitudes, rotating predictably. Aircraft were allocated according to expectation, not alarm. The sky above the carriers was guarded but not strained. There was no surge, no mass scramble, no reallocation that suggested crisis. The idea of an imminent attack felt unlikely because it contradicted the plan's logic. Midway was to be neutralized first. Only then would American carriers respond. To expect otherwise would mean acknowledging that the enemy had already anticipated Japanese movements, an unsettling thought that found little support in intelligence estimates. Surprise, in Japanese thinking, belonged to Japan. The fleet had sailed undetected. The operation was complex and dispersed, its layers designed to confuse and mislead. Even when fragmentary reports hinted at American presence, they were filtered through this assumption. An enemy that surprised Japan was almost unthinkable. Caution, under these circumstances, was mistaken for discipline. To hold fighters in reserve, to avoid premature commitment, appeared prudent. Scrambling everything at the first hint of danger risked exhausting pilots and aircraft before the decisive moment. Control was still valued over reaction. Urgency was therefore postponed. Decisions waited for confirmation. Alerts remained measured. The fleet did not yet feel threatened in its core. The battle, as imagined, had not begun. Yet while Japanese commanders delayed escalation, the sky began to change. Small, disjointed American attacks were already forming unimpressive in isolation, but relentless in intent. They would arrive not as a single coordinated blow, but as a series of interruptions. Each wave drew fighters lower, farther, thinner. Each response felt manageable, and with every interception, confidence grew that the enemy was weak, disorganized, incapable of decisive action. What no one yet recognized was that these attacks were not meant to succeed on their own. They were shaping the airspace, consuming attention, bending the geometry of defense. By the time the need to scramble everything became obvious, the window for doing so cleanly had already closed. And above the scattered clouds, another force was descending, unseen, unopposed, and perfectly timed. The first American aircraft did not arrive as a coordinated force. They came in fragments, small groups, emerging from different directions at different altitudes, with little apparent synchronization. To Japanese observers, the attacks looked improvised, almost desperate. This was not how a decisive carrier strike was supposed to unfold. Torpedo bombers appeared low over the water, flying straight and slow, exposed to every gun and fighter above them. They pressed on despite heavy fire, holding their course with grim persistence. One formation was destroyed almost entirely. Then another followed, and then another. Losses were catastrophic, hits were few. Tactically, the attacks failed. Japanese combat air patrols responded with skill and confidence. Fighters dove aggressively, breaking up formations, shooting down attackers in quick succession. Pilots reported victories with professional calm. The airspace above the fleet remained contested but controlled. Each intercepted wave seemed to confirm what commanders already believed. The enemy was brave, but disorganized, determined, but ineffective. These victories reinforced confidence. Reports of American losses flowed steadily. The carriers remained untouched. The fleet's guns and fighters were doing exactly what they had been trained to do. There was no reason yet to doubt the system. But the attacks did not stop. Wave after wave arrived, never strong enough to overwhelm defenses, never coordinated enough to break through, yet relentless in their timing. Each demanded response. Each required fighters to descend, to pursue, to engage. The Japanese pilots did not ignore these threats. They met them head-on, as doctrine and instinct demanded. Gradually, the geometry of defense began to shift. Fighters were pulled lower, chasing torpedo bombers, skimming the waves. Others were drawn outward, pursuing retreating aircraft beyond the immediate perimeter of the fleet. The layered structure of altitude, high cover, mid-level interception, low defense began to flatten. Altitude control eroded not through error, but through necessity. There was no single order that caused it. No moment when someone chose vulnerability. It happened incrementally, as each small threat demanded immediate attention. The sky became crowded at the wrong heights. Above this churning airspace, something was missing. High-altitude cover thinned. Eyes were focused downward, outward, immediate. Radar was limited. Visual detection ruled the day. What could not be seen was not yet considered dangerous. Below decks, operations continued. Rearming progressed. Aircraft waited. Fuel flowed. The carriers still felt secure because no bombs had yet fallen. The warning signs were subtle, too subtle to interrupt routine. From the Japanese perspective, the battle seemed to be unfolding favorably. The enemy was attacking prematurely, wasting aircraft, revealing weakness. The fleet was absorbing the blows with minimal damage. Confidence hardened into reassurance. But the sky was changing its message. The American attacks, though failing tactically, were succeeding strategically. They were not designed to win outright. They were stripping away altitude, consuming attention, exhausting reaction time. They were shaping the battlefield invisibly, minute by minute. Japanese pilots were fighting continuously now, cycling through engagements without pause. Aircraft returned low on fuel. Fighters landed, refueled, and launched again. Fatigue crept in not as collapse, but as narrowing focus. The defensive geometry that Japanese doctrine relied upon, ordered layers, predictable interception zones, was beginning to fray. It was not broken, but it was no longer whole, and somewhere, above the scattered clouds, beyond the altitudes where Japanese eyes were trained to look, another formation was approaching, silent, compact, and perfectly aligned with the moment the sky could no longer protect the fleet. The warnings had been there all along. They simply did not look like danger until it was too late to look up. Below the flight decks of the Japanese carriers, the hangars were crowded with aircraft in transition. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes stood nose to tail, wings folded, crews moving carefully between them. Some had returned from the Midway strike and waited for inspection. Others were being prepared for a mission that had not yet been fully defined. The spaces were full, but not chaotic. Order still prevailed. Fuel lines remained active. Aviation gasoline flowed steadily into tanks, measured and controlled, as it always was. Hoses ran across steel decks. Vapors hung faintly in the air. Familiar to crews who had lived with this danger for years, it was an accepted risk, managed through discipline and routine. Bombs and torpedoes sat exposed. Some were stacked along the hangar sides. Others were already mounted beneath aircraft. Armor-piercing bombs waited beside torpedoes designed for ships that had not yet been fully confirmed. The ordnance reflected uncertainty, not confusion, but preparedness for multiple possibilities. Rearming continued methodically. Crews worked through checklists, adjusting loads, securing fuses, coordinating with officers who awaited final orders. There was no pause in the process. No command had been given to clear decks or isolate fuel. The assumption remained that there was time to finish properly. From within this system, progress felt productive. Aircraft were becoming ready. Options were being preserved. The carriers appeared poised to deliver a decisive blow once the situation clarified. To stop would mean abandoning readiness. To rush would mean courting disaster. So the work continued. Above decks, the battle in the air seemed to justify this calm. American attacks were being repelled. No bombs had struck. Damage was minimal. The carriers had survived repeated assaults. Confidence held. What was not visible was how risk was accumulating. Every fueled aircraft added energy, every armed bomb added potential. The hangars, designed as working spaces, were becoming reservoirs of explosive possibility. This was not negligence. It was the natural consequence of a system built to maximize striking power. Japanese doctrine did not conceive of carriers as fragile. They were seen as resilient platforms, protected by fighters and skill. The idea that an attack could penetrate to the hangars in seconds before alarms before reaction was outside expectation. Defense was thought to be a process, not a moment. And so vulnerability peaked quietly. There was no warning bell, no dramatic failure, only a growing concentration of fuel, explosives, and aircraft, all waiting for a future that was assumed to arrive on schedule. The irony was profound. The very measures taken to maintain flexibility to be ready for any target had created a condition of extreme sensitivity. The carriers were prepared for action, but not for interruption. As crews moved carefully among bombs and hoses, the ships remained alive with activity. Radios crackled, engines turned, orders were anticipated. Nothing yet demanded interruption. Above, the sky seemed to clear. The immediate threats had been handled. The air grew momentarily empty. And in that brief opening between attacks, between decisions, another force slipped through, descending from altitude, unseen by eyes trained elsewhere. The decks were ready for a battle that would never arrive in the form they expected. They arrived from above, not in strength, but in position. American dive bombers emerged from the high sun, descending through gaps that no longer belonged to anyone. Their approach was silent until it was sudden black shapes tipping over, noses down, engines screaming as gravity took command. It was not brilliance that delivered them. It was timing. Japanese fighter cover was misplaced. Not absent, but elsewhere drawn low by torpedo attacks, scattered outward by pursuit, cycling through fuel and rearmament. The sky above the carriers, once layered and guarded, was briefly empty at the wrong altitude. No doctrine accounted for this moment because no plan had imagined it. Detection came seconds too late. Lookouts saw the silhouettes just as they broke into dives. Alarms sounded into a space that had already changed. Fighters clawed upward, guns firing at angles that offered no solution. There was no time to reassemble defense. The geometry had already failed. The first bombs fell into prepared decks. They did not need precision beyond gravity. One struck near elevators crowded with aircraft. Another penetrated into hangar space, dense with fuel and ordnance. The conditions below decks created methodically, rationally answered instantly. Fires spread with mechanical inevitability. Aviation gasoline vapor ignited. Bombs cooked off. Shockwaves traveled through confined spaces, tearing through aircraft, igniting hoses, collapsing bulkheads. What had been order became energy without control. Damage cascaded beyond command. Firefighting crews moved into infernos that no training could master. Water pressure failed. Heat overwhelmed compartments. Explosions followed explosions, not as isolated incidents, but as a chain reaction born of proximity. Each carrier's internal environment turned against itself. On the bridges, comprehension lagged behind reality. Reports were fragmentary, drowned in smoke and noise. Officers issued orders that assumed survivable damage. But survivability depended on separation between fuel and flame, between bombs and airframes. That separation no longer existed. Within minutes, Akagi was mortally wounded. Kaga burned uncontrollably. Soryu followed. Crews fought with discipline and courage, but physics had replaced tactics. The carriers were no longer platforms of war. They were sources of fire. The plan collapsed, not through resistance, but through exposure. Years of preparation unraveled in less time than it took to brief a strike. The carefully balanced sequence Midway first, carriers later ceased to exist. There was no longer a future phase to reach. This was not a failure of courage. Japanese airmen and sailors fought without hesitation. It was not even a failure of intelligence in the narrow sense. It was the consequence of a system that assumed time could be managed, controlled, delayed. The 10 minutes did not feel decisive as they passed. There was no single explosion that announced the end. Only the realization, spreading slowly, that recovery was no longer possible. That something fundamental had been lost, not just ships, but the ability to continue as planned. As smoke climbed and decks glowed, the Pacific fell briefly quiet again. The noise of battle faded into crackle and collapse. And in that quiet, the truth emerged not all at once, but clearly enough. The war had shifted, not by design, but by a handful of minutes that could never be reclaimed. In the immediate aftermath, Japanese commanders did not yet understand what had happened. The scale of the loss was obscured by smoke, noise, and disbelief. From the bridges of surviving ships, the carriers were still visible, burning, damaged, but afloat. Warships had survived fires before. The assumption, instinctive and human, was that recovery remained possible. Reports arrived in fragments. Communications lines were strained, some severed entirely. Messages conflicted. One carrier was said to be burning but stable. Another reported explosions below decks. Timelines overlapped. Nothing formed a coherent picture. Officers tried to assemble meaning from partial sentences and shouted updates, but the battle had outpaced the language used to describe it. Smoke obscured reality literally and figuratively. Thick black columns rose thousands of feet into the air, hiding decks and flight operations from view. From a distance, it was impossible to tell whether aircraft were launching or being consumed. Fire turned the carriers into silhouettes, their outlines familiar but their condition unknowable. Orders were issued into this uncertainty. Commands to prepare counterstrikes, instructions to maneuver, to close, to support damage control. Each order assumed capabilities that no longer existed. Aircraft that were meant to launch had already burned. Crews expected to fight fires found passageways blocked by wreckage and heat. Damage control teams fought physics, not flames. Fire hoses lost pressure as pipes ruptured. Steel warped. Ammunition detonated in spaces never designed to absorb blast. Discipline held, but discipline could not cool aviation fuel once it had ignited across an enclosed deck. Training met limits it had never been designed to face. As minutes passed, the realization deepened that the carriers were not merely damaged, they were operationally dead. Aircraft could not be recovered. Flight decks were unusable. Command centers were compromised. What remained were ships that floated but could no longer fight. The fleet began to lose coherence. With the carriers neutralized, the structure of the operation collapsed. Screens designed to protect striking forces now circled burning hulls. Subordinate units waited for orders that could no longer be properly formed. The battle was no longer about executing a plan, it was about understanding whether one still existed. Initiative vanished quietly. There was no formal moment when command passed to the enemy. It simply dissolved. Japanese forces reacted rather than directed, responding to emergencies instead of shaping events. Time, which had been assumed manageable, now dictated every choice. Some commanders attempted to regroup, to consider further strikes using remaining assets. Others focused solely on survival. The absence of clear information made both approaches tentative. Without carriers, air power, the core of Japanese naval strategy, had been amputated in a single morning. The emotional shock was delayed. Professional restraint held it at bay. But beneath that restraint lay something deeper than surprise. There was confusion not just about what had happened, but about how it had been allowed to happen so completely. This was not how decisive battles were supposed to unfold. There had been no drawn-out exchange, no gradual wearing down. The carriers had gone from dominance to helplessness in the span of minutes. Doctrine offered no explanation that fit the experience unfolding before them. As smoke continued to rise and fires burned unchecked, the truth pressed closer. This was not a temporary reversal, it was a structural collapse. The combined fleet still existed on paper, but its center of gravity had been erased. And even as commanders struggled to comprehend the loss, another realization waited just beyond reach, one that would not fully form until the fires burned themselves out. The battle was over. The consequences were only beginning to surface. The loss at Midway was not measured only in ships. With the carriers went their aircraft, hundreds of machines destroyed, not in combat, but where they stood, fueled and armed. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes that represented years of design and refinement vanished in fire and smoke. More importantly, they vanished together. So did the men who flew them. Japanese naval aviation had been built slowly, deliberately, around elite crews trained through years of rigorous selection. Experience was concentrated, not dispersed. Pilots were not rotated out after missions. They remained with their units, flying repeatedly until lost. At Midway, This structure turned catastrophic. Entire air groups were extinguished in a single morning. There was no reserve waiting behind them. Replacement pilots existed, but not replacements of equal experience. Training pipelines were long, careful, and unforgiving. Skill was cultivated, not improvised. What was lost could not be recreated quickly, nor, in some cases, at all. Replacement capacity could not compensate because it was never designed to. Japanese doctrine assumed that decisive battles would limit prolonged attrition. The system produced excellence, not volume. When excellence was destroyed en masse, there was nothing ready to take its place. Doctrine offered no rapid adaptation. Carrier warfare had been refined under assumptions of initiative and surprise. Midway shattered those assumptions, but doctrine could not adjust in real time. There were no established procedures for fighting without carrier dominance, no rehearsed alternatives for recovering from sudden annihilation of air power. The operational core of the fleet was destroyed, not only materially, but conceptually. The carriers were the heart around which everything else functioned. Without them, battleships had no role, cruisers no purpose beyond escort, submarines no coordinated strategy. The combined fleet remained afloat, but it no longer possessed a center. Momentum reversed instantly. Until Midway, Japan had chosen when and where to fight. After Midway, reaction replaced initiative. Defensive planning supplanted offensive design. Operations became cautious, limited by uncertainty rather than guided by confidence. This reversal was not immediately understood in full. Ships still sailed, commands were still issued, but the tempo had changed. The war no longer moved to Japanese timing. The enemy, previously assumed slow and reactive, now dictated pace. Strategic balance shifted permanently because Midway removed more than capacity, it removed belief. The conviction that planning could control outcomes was shaken. The assumption that perfection guaranteed safety was broken. What replaced it was not clarity, but restraint. American industry, meanwhile, operated under a different logic. Losses could be absorbed, crews could be replaced, ships could be built in numbers unimaginable within Japanese constraints. Midway did not end the war, but it revealed which system could survive it. Japanese officers would later speak of Midway not as a defeat, but as a rupture. A moment when the war they had prepared for ceased to exist, replaced by one they could not shape. The future became defensive, incremental, uncertain. Recovery was impossible, because what had been lost was not just material or manpower, but alignment between doctrine, capacity, and reality. The system that had delivered early victories could not function in the world Midway created. From that day forward, every Japanese operation carried the shadow of that morning. Plans were smaller, risks were avoided, time was no longer assumed to be available. The Pacific War continued, but it continued under new terms, set not by ambition, but by limitation. And only later would it become clear that Midway had not merely stopped Japan's advance, it had quietly decided its direction. Japanese planning for Midway left no margin for surprise, because it believed surprise had already been secured. Every movement, every phase, every contingency was designed to unfold in sequence, each step dependent on the one before it. The plan did not ask what might happen if the order of events reversed. It assumed the enemy would comply with expectation. Precision was the guiding principle. Strikes were to be launched at calculated intervals. Aircraft were to be armed with exact loads for known targets. Reconnaissance would confirm assumptions already made. In this world, accuracy replaced adaptability. The plan did not bend. It proceeded. But precision eliminated flexibility. When information arrived late or incomplete, the system had no mechanism to absorb it quickly. Decisions were not wrong, they were simply slow. Each adjustment required alignment with the whole, and alignment required time. What could not be reconciled immediately was deferred. Excellence, cultivated over years, reduced resilience. Japanese naval aviation was superb at executing what it had rehearsed. It was less prepared for what it had not. Training emphasized mastery of known procedures rather than improvisation under uncertainty. At Midway, uncertainty was the defining condition. Every delay magnified exposure. A few minutes lost to confirmation became a quarter hour spent rearming. A quarter hour became an hour in which decks filled and skies shifted. None of these delays felt decisive as they occurred. They accumulated quietly, invisibly, until they intersected with an enemy moving faster, not better. The system punished deviation. To act outside protocol risked disrupting coordination across the fleet. Individual initiative was constrained not by fear, but by structure. Officers who considered accelerating processes or altering sequences lacked authority to do so decisively. The price of unity was hesitation. Adaptation came too late, because recognition came too late. By the time Japanese commanders understood that the battle was unfolding outside their assumptions, the conditions necessary for adaptation no longer existed. Aircraft were lost, crews were dead, decks were aflame. Flexibility requires options, and options had already burned. The cost of perfectionism was not arrogance, it was fragility. A system designed to perform flawlessly under expected conditions collapsed when conditions changed abruptly. Midway did not defeat Japanese naval aviation by outmatching it. It bypassed it. What made the outcome irreversible was not the loss of carriers alone, but the loss of alignment between doctrine and reality. Japanese planning had assumed a war of decisive moments. The Pacific would instead become a war of sustained pressure, production, and adaptation elements. The system was not built to dominate. In hindsight, Midway appears sudden. But within the Japanese experience, it was the end point of accumulated certainty. Every success before it had reinforced belief in method. Every rehearsal had confirmed the value of control. There had been no incentive to imagine collapse. After Midway, that certainty was gone. But certainty, once broken, cannot be restored by will alone. Doctrine can be revised, but only after loss reveals its limits. At Midway, the revelation arrived all at once. Japanese officers would later reflect that no single mistake decided the battle. That assessment was accurate and incomplete. The battle was decided by a system that could not afford to be wrong even briefly. When time slipped, it had nothing left to spend. The price was irreversible, because it was paid not only in ships and men, but in belief. Belief that preparation guaranteed control. Belief that excellence ensured safety. Belief that time would wait. Midway proved otherwise. And from that proof flowed the remainder of the war, longer, harsher, and increasingly one-sided. What had failed was not courage or skill, but the assumption that perfection could survive surprise. In the years after the war, Japanese officers struggled to describe Midway in conventional terms. Their accounts did not center on incompetence or betrayal, nor did they search for a single catastrophic error. Instead, they returned repeatedly to confusion, an atmosphere rather than a decision, a condition rather than a cause. Many wrote that the battle never felt fully real, even as it unfolded. Events moved too quickly, information arrived too slowly, and understanding lagged behind consequence. Midway, in memory, was less a sequence of actions than a blur of moments that refused to arrange themselves into clarity. No single mistake was blamed because none could be isolated. There was no order that doomed the fleet, no officer whose decision could be cleanly condemned. Attempts to reduce the battle to one turning point felt dishonest. The loss had been systemic, not personal. This made it difficult to speak about. In military cultures accustomed to accountability, Midway resisted simplification. Officers described doing what doctrine required, following plans that had worked before, reacting to information as it appeared. The outcome did not match intention, and intention did not explain the outcome. What lingered most vividly in memory were minutes, not decisions. 10 minutes, 5 minutes. A delay of moments that could not be measured until after everything was lost. Time, not judgment, became the language of reflection. Some recalled waiting for confirmation, waiting for clarity, waiting for orders that arrived too late to matter. Others remembered acting decisively, only to discover that decisiveness had come at the wrong moment. Memory fractured along these lines, offering no single narrative strong enough to replace what had been lost. Silence often replaced justification. In post-war interviews and memoirs, long pauses appear where explanations might have been expected. Officers describe smoke, heat, and noise, but stopped short of assigning blame. Midway was treated less as a failure to be defended than as an experience to be endured. Reflection replaced pride. Before Midway, Japanese naval aviation had been a symbol of mastery. Afterward, it became a subject of introspection. The confidence that had once animated planning gave way to a quieter tone, one shaped by awareness of limits rather than belief in inevitability. For many, the most unsettling aspect was how ordinary the morning had felt. The absence of drama before catastrophe troubled memory more than the explosions themselves. It suggested that disaster did not announce itself, that it could emerge from routine without warning. As the years passed, Midway evolved into a cautionary tale rather than a grievance. It was cited not to assign fault, but to warn against rigidity, against the belief that success confirms permanence, against the temptation to mistake preparation for immunity. Japanese officers did not remember Midway as a moment when courage failed. They remembered it as a moment when understanding failed to keep pace with events. When systems designed for excellence proved brittle under pressure, they had not been designed to absorb. In this way, Midway remained unresolved, even in memory, not because it was misunderstood, but because it resisted the comfort of explanation. It stood as a reminder that war does not always reward the better plan, only the more adaptable one. And so, in recollection, Midway became less a battle than a lesson one learned too late, and remembered not with anger, but with restraint. It was not the noise of defeat that endured, but the quiet recognition of how little time there had been to change it. Midway is often remembered as a moment, a sudden reversal, a dramatic swing of fortune in the middle of a single morning. But what it really proved was something quieter and more enduring. That wars are decided by systems, not moments. The bombs that fell in June 1942 mattered because of the structures that made their effects irreversible. Time, at Midway, functioned as a weapon, not in the sense of speed alone, but in accumulation. Minutes lost to procedure became opportunities seized by an opponent willing to act without certainty. Time rewarded movement over completion, reaction over perfection. It favored those who accepted risk sooner. Flexibility outweighed brilliance. Japanese naval aviation was technically superior, tactically refined, and professionally executed. Yet its excellence was optimized for conditions it expected, not those it encountered. The American response was imperfect, disorganized, and costly, but it adapted in real time. It traded elegance for immediacy. Doctrine, Midway demonstrated, must breathe. When doctrine hardens into ritual, it ceases to guide judgment and begins to replace it. Japanese doctrine had produced extraordinary results when reality aligned with rehearsal. When it did not, doctrine constrained rather than enabled. Perfect plans are fragile because they rely on stability. They assume sequence, compliance, and time. At Midway, sequence collapsed. Compliance vanished. Time slipped. The plan did not fail because it was unsound. It failed because it could not bend without breaking. Initiative belongs to those who move first, not those who move flawlessly. The American attacks that morning were rarely coordinated. Many failed completely, but each one forced response. Each consumed attention. Each reshaped the battlefield. Initiative was seized not through dominance, but through insistence. Modern warfare accelerates relentlessly. Midway was an early warning of this truth. Technology compressed decision-making. Air power collapsed distance. The window between detection and destruction narrowed beyond what rigid systems could tolerate. Wars would no longer wait for clarity. For Japan, Midway exposed the limits of pre-war assumptions. For the world, it marked a transition from wars shaped by preparation to wars shaped by adaptation. Victory would belong not to those who planned best, but to those who learned fastest. This lesson would echo beyond the Pacific. Armies and navies would rethink training, command structures, and doctrine. Decentralization, redundancy, and flexibility would gain value. The cost of rigidity would be measured not in theory, but in ships lost and wars prolonged. Midway did not end the conflict, but it defined its trajectory. After that morning, the initiative shifted, never to return in the same form. The balance of the Pacific tilted not because one side became weaker overnight, but because one system proved more resilient under pressure. In the end, what Midway proved was not that Japan made mistakes, or that America found luck. It proved that in modern war, time punishes certainty. It rewards motion. It favors those who accept imperfection in exchange for speed. The Pacific War would grind on for years, shaped by industry, endurance, and adaptation. But its character, fast, unforgiving, and system-driven, had already been revealed. And in that revelation lay the quiet verdict of Midway. No single delay doomed Japan at Midway. There was no missed signal that alone determined the outcome, no order issued too late that can bear the full weight of defeat. History often searches for such moments because they are easy to name. Midway offered none. No single order sealed defeat either. Every command given that morning was defensible in isolation. Each followed doctrine, experience, and reason. Officers acted as they had been trained to act within a system that had rewarded those instincts before. Nothing felt reckless. Nothing felt final. Instead, the plan died quietly, minute by minute. Time was not lost all at once. It was spent on confirmation, on procedure, on care. Each expenditure seemed minor. Each was justified. Together, they emptied the account. Confidence consumed time because confidence assumed surplus. Japanese commanders believed they possessed enough margin to finish properly, enough control to wait for clarity. Confidence slowed the sense of urgency, replacing compression with completion. The fleet did not rush because it believed it did not need to. Procedure replaced urgency without announcing itself. Checklists continued. Cycles completed. Rearming proceeded. The machinery of excellence worked exactly as designed, even as conditions shifted beyond what it had been designed to face. There was no alarm for doctrine itself. Opportunity vanished without warning because opportunity does not signal its departure. It exists briefly, between decisions, and disappears when the next step takes too long. At Midway, opportunity slipped away in the space between intention and execution. What made the defeat so enduring was not its violence, but its subtlety. The carriers did not fall because of chaos, but because order persisted too long. The system did not break, it held rigidly until the environment around it changed beyond recovery. In the aftermath, it was tempting to ask what should have been done differently. Faster launches, earlier scrambles, fewer confirmations. But these questions misunderstand the nature of the loss. Midway was not decided by choosing the wrong option. It was decided by believing there was still time to choose. The pauses between decisions became decisive. Each hesitation narrowed the future without announcing that it was doing so. Each moment of restraint reduced the range of possible responses. By the time urgency became undeniable, urgency no longer mattered. This is why Midway resists simple judgment. It was not a failure of courage, intelligence, or skill. It was a failure to recognize that time itself had become the battlefield. And on that battlefield, hesitation is never neutral. They lost Midway not in a moment, but in accumulation. Not through a single error, but through a pattern of restraint that no longer matched the speed of war. The pauses were inaudible. The consequences were not. In the end, the lesson of Midway is not about Japan alone. It is about systems that mistake control for safety and preparation for immunity. It is about how success, when unexamined, hardens into expectation. History remembers explosions and wreckage, but what decided Midway was quieter than that. It was the sound of minutes passing, unchallenged. They lost Midway not when the bombs fell, but in the moments when no one believed they needed to hurry.